Welcome back, everyone. Today we begin Unit 4, The Church in the Modern World, the final unit in our History of Christianity course. And I want to emphasize modern. We begin today to enter into a life world that scholars refer to as modernity. That collection of habits, life ways, worldviews, and philosophical positions that inform the culture in which we all live. All of us, to some degree or another, are inescapably modern. And I don't want to say that that's necessarily a bad thing. Throughout the remainder of these lectures, you'll get the impression from me that there is a critique of modernity that should be on the church's lips. But first and foremost, I want to say that no single period in history has ever been a golden age. The ancient church was not a golden age. The medieval era was not a golden age. And modernity, likewise, is not some sort of dark age. Not necessarily. So that earlier critique we made when we entered into the medieval world and said we're not going to refer to it as the Dark Ages, that critique applies here as well. We're not going to refer to modernity as a dark age either. However, there is a critique to be made, and many scholars have made it. I have here a collection of books of what basically amounts to a new field, modernity studies. And from a sort of classical Christian perspective, we have a whole series of works. Although, interestingly, one of these, Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, was written at a time when MacIntyre was a Marxist. But in the writing of this book, he came to the position that the fundamental choice that modernity gives us is between Aristotle and Nietzsche. Not being able to choose Nietzsche, he chose Aristotle. Right, modernity comes after virtue ethics, after Aristotelianism, and he attempted to choose Aristotle as a Marxist, but he came to see that Aristotelianism is raised to a higher pitch by Thomas Aquinas, and as a result, he converted to Christianity. He became Catholic. There are also works like Michael Allen Gillespie's The Theological Origins of Modernity. Now, when we started the YouTube portion of our History of Christianity lectures, we actually made reference to some of the scholarship that Gillespie did. Namely, that our first lecture was on the threefold intellectual position of univocalism, voluntarism, and nominalism. The position that God's existence is equally capturable by language as our existence, and therefore God and the creation exist on a kind of flat level zero-sum playing field. That's univocalism. Voluntarism, the idea that the will is absolutely supreme over reason, both within God and within humanity. So that would be the position of both Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. If you remove God from the picture, we end up with the human as simply a willing agent. That would be Friedrich Nietzsche. And then third, we saw nominalism, related to voluntarism, in that within nominalism, there are no metaphysically real entities. That is, things down here, particulars, do not have substances in common within them, and they do not have forms common among them up there in the Platonic realm, depending on whether you're Platonist or Aristotelian. Modernity assumes all three of these. Modernity assumes univocalism, it assumes voluntarism, and it assumes nominalism. And hence the title of the book, The Theological Origins of Modernity. As unchristian as people might suppose themselves to be, nevertheless, modern and late modern and postmodern individuals, atheists though they may be, are still working within larger Christian theological debates. Another major thinker is John Milbank. Now I have here Theology and Social Theory, Beyond Secular Reason. I hold this up because it's the only work of John Milbank that I actually own. But he also identified Duns Scotus and univocalism as being at the intellectual root of modernity, even though Duns Scotus is writing around the year 1300, 200 years before modernity even begins to appear. Then there's Charles Taylor, who I believe in 2007 came out with his monumental work, A Secular Age, in which he investigated the way in which modernity revamps Christianity. It doesn't simply reject it. That's an earlier misunderstanding and a narrative. Rather, it revamps Christianity for its own purposes. But it does so by closing off the world. By, for instance, making a clear and absolute distinction between the supernatural and the natural in causality. So that there are miracles and then there are scientific events, and one event has to be one or the other. There's so much more to this book, and I don't recommend starting off with any of these books, certainly not if you're a beginner. However, if you're interested in these, I can't point you to a better resource than James K. Smith's How Not to Be Secular. This is a sort of summary of Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, and it goes through all the major ideas: univocalism, nominalism, permeable membrane, this idea that the world is not sort of a hermetically sealed scientific jar in which natural causation happens, and if God wants to interfere, he has to break the rules. All of these ideas are contained within this. And if you're still thinking, well, I don't have time for that, or I'm not that interested, although I hope at the end of today's lecture you will be, then I can simply recommend a book that I've recommended already, Ron Dreher's The Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation, particularly Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is The Roots of the Crisis. Where does our current crisis as Christians in America originate? It doesn't originate in the 1980s or the 1960s. It doesn't originate with the conflict over abortion, or even the earlier conflicts over slavery, or even the Enlightenment. It goes all the way back to the late Middle Ages. On that, all of these theorists, all of these thinkers would be in agreement. And that's why it was so important for us to nail down the ideas of univocalism, voluntarism, and nominalism. Now, if nominalism, univocalism, and voluntarism form really the first ingredient of modernity, we should recognize that there are at least 5 others. It would be a mistake to claim that modernity is reducible to these earlier theological constructs. Rather, there are a whole series of components that go into making this modern worldview. Really, it's in the making from about 1300 all the way up, I would claim, until at least 1800, and really it doesn't come to full flower until the 20th century, where it starts to wane. And that waning we call post-modernity. We call postmodernism. So the second major ingredient below univocalism, voluntarism, and nominalism would be Renaissance humanism. Now, eventually we can take the Renaissance humanism out, the Christian humanism out, and simply refer to humanism when secular worldviews try to also remain humanistic, to focus on the goods of the human person. But that is a later move that will be made and in some cases found wanting. But it is that focus on worldly goods and human experience. The 3 that we're going to look at today, or ingredients 3, 4, and 5, build upon humanism in many ways. First of all, there is the scientific revolution. Now, the scientific revolution is that movement that we associate with figures like Copernicus and Galileo in early modern Europe, particularly the 16th and 17th centuries. What I want us to focus on for the purposes of constructing modernity is that the scientific revolution proposes a new method for learning true knowledge about the world, and that is the scientific method of knowledge by experimentation. And I think it will be helpful for us to distinguish this from the viewpoint of Aristotle. Aristotle's viewpoint was that, yes, ultimate reality is found down here, truths about the world are knowable down here. However, while he did go out and have Alexander the Great collect specimens from around the world, he would compare lizards, he would compare plants and develop an idea of botany. Nevertheless, he believed that knowledge came through observation, looking about a thing, reflecting on it, thinking about it, doing the mental work of taking in the concept of their substance into the mind. The modern scientific worldview, of course, isn't that. It's knowledge by experimentation, by setting up a series of controls and variables and running multiple confirmable experiments. That's the true form of knowledge. Now, just like with Aristotle, that's not the only way you could know things. Thomas Aquinas, of course, raises Aristotelianism to another peak where there is knowledge by observation, but there is also a sort of interior knowledge. So, too, the scientific revolution, like Renaissance Christian humanism, doesn't exclude historic Christian orthodoxy. These are some of modernity's great goods. However, what we will see is that both Renaissance humanism and the scientific revolution tend to push out their competitors, so that worldly goods become the only goods. Knowledge by experimentation becomes the only path to true knowledge. And this then leads to our next ingredient, a systematic criticism of received truths. Now, the Protestant Reformation certainly has a lot to do with this. After all, what was the Protestant Reformation if not looking back at the previous 500 years of theological and practical development, or the previous 1,000 years, or the previous 1,500 years for some of the radical reformers and even some of the anti-Trinitarian Socinians, looking back over that time and critiquing what had been received as tradition, what had been handed on and received. It's not too far of a step to go from there to critiquing the scriptures themselves, right? To go from saying, well, this practice, this doctrine, that doctrine, weren't handed on correctly. Well, how do we know the faith itself was handed on correctly? How do we know that the canon of Scripture is correct? How do we know that the canon of Scripture is the Word of God at all? Maybe James shouldn't be in there. Maybe Esther shouldn't be in there. Maybe Paul shouldn't be on there. This takes flight very quickly within a couple hundred years or so, such that by the end of the 18th century, critiquing the scriptures themselves, critiquing the core doctrines of the creed themselves, is a major enterprise, a major scholarly enterprise within Europe. And that is closely related to the next ingredient we will look at today, and that's the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is an 18th century European movement primarily found in Great Britain, France, and Germany, which has a kind of faith in autonomous human accomplishment. So because of the goods that the Renaissance provides, because of the power of the scientific revolution's method of knowledge by experimentation, because of those profound goods, it becomes very clear to many Enlightenment thinkers that we simply don't need God, the Bible, or the church. However you would define it, we don't need those in order to pursue worldly goods. We don't need those in order to pursue a sort of technologically equipped material abundance. And therefore, if there is a God, he existed long ago, he created the world, but that's all we can really know about him, and that's all we'd really want to know about him. Even if you could demonstrate, no, in fact, God intervened dramatically in history in the death and resurrection of Jesus, it wouldn't matter. So notice how modernity doesn't just question Christianity. It actually makes it irrelevant, so that even if Christianity could prove its point, it ultimately wouldn't matter. And we'll see that come to its highest pitch with Friedrich Nietzsche. But before we get to Nietzsche, we will end there today, but there's one further ingredient that we will cover not next time, but the time after that. And that's that all of this leads to a seemingly natural conflict between faith and reason. After all, if reason comes through experimentation, then that's... if knowledge comes through experimentation, and reason is the outcome of that scientific knowledge, then faith really can't be a form of true knowledge. You can't know things by belief. Now, of course, Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther would both completely question this idea. Right? After all, we have true knowledge of things by belief all the time. Maybe not certain absolute knowledge, but we have no reasonable grounds for doubt. For instance, if I told you I was married on May 26th, 2012, and you knew that I was a trustworthy person, and it wasn't in one of these examples where I'm just as liable to lie in order to show, to make some other point. If I just told you that casually in conversation, you'd believe me. You'd take it as a fact. That is belief. That is what Aristotle and Aquinas and Luther all agree counts as knowledge by belief. It's true knowledge because it depends on the trustworthiness of the speaker. The Enlightenment sweeps all that aside, as we'll see later in today's lecture. Now, today's lecture, in particular, is about the reaction of the Catholic Church to early modernity. This is simply because, for one, the Catholic Church is more engaged in these sorts of arguments over faith and reason than Protestants are. As we'll see, Protestants have a tendency to give in to the separation between faith and reason, to locate faith within the feelings rather than within the mind. Catholicism has never done that, and it certainly hasn't done that after Thomas Aquinas. So, the Catholic Church is more engaged in these questions of faith and reason that modernity raises. It's also simply a fact of history that many of early modernity's conflicts happen within Catholic lands. They happen in Italy, Poland, France. But that doesn't mean this is an exclusively Catholic lecture. We will also have occasion today to move over to the British Isles and see what's going on there in the Protestant world. Now, to begin with, let's start with the scientific revolution. Remember that during the 12th century Renaissance, writings from the Greek-speaking East had moved in following the Crusades into the Western world. And part of those writings included the recovery of ancient Greek medical and scientific knowledge. So we got writers like Aristotle, who of course is not simply a philosopher, he's a natural philosopher as well. He works with botany and anatomy and animal science and celestial motion and almost anything you can imagine. Aristotle covered it. And then there's figures like Ptolemy, who came up with the Ptolemaic system of the universe, in which the world is a round series of spheres. At the center of the cosmos is the Earth, and the sun orbits around it. Now, the Earth is round, and the medievals knew that, and the ancients knew it as well. But it's round, and the sun orbits around it. Then there are the ancient medical theories of folks like Hippocrates, after whom the Hippocratic Oath is named, and the Roman follower of Hippocrates, or student of Hippocrates at some distance of centuries, Galen. Now, at this point, it is worth mentioning that there is a crisis occasioned by the discovery of the Americas. The Americas are discovered by Columbus in 1492, and within 10 years, the Europeans realize that he has not reached Asia. He's reached two continents heretofore unknown. Right? And in these continents, unknown to the ancient world, there are a whole series of peoples. The Incas, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Iroquois. Eventually they'll discover the Apache and the Comanche and the Sioux, and all of these people not recorded in the Bible and unknown to the ancient Greeks and Romans. And this causes something to click. And this is maybe why we no longer see any Renaissances the way we have in the Carolingian Renaissance, the 12th century Renaissance, and the Italian and wider European Renaissance, the 15th century. Because all of a sudden, it is very clear to everyone, and no one can deny it, that the ancients didn't know everything, that we can learn more, that we can move forward, that we can have genuine progress in knowledge. In fact, since we're talking about the construction of modernity, all these disparate elements that will eventually come together and coalesce in a common worldview, it's also worth noting that the discovery of the Americas is one of the critical ingredients in the dissolution of the medieval worldview, the collapse or deconstruction of medieval civilization. And there are a number of ingredients to that, and we've now gone over them, so I'll mention them briefly. First of all, there's a total loss of confidence in medieval institutions. Think about the Avignon Schism, in which after the return from Avignon to Rome, the popes then go into schism, and there is a pope in both Rome and in Avignon, and then in Pisa, and then the Council of Pisa fails to solve the problem. These the confidence that medievals could have in the papacy, the confidence that they could have, for instance, in the age of Innocent III and the Great Lateran Council, that is shattered. And if the papacy is shattered, then the medieval worldview is really shattered. Because after all, who puts the crown on the king's or the emperor's head? Ultimately, in some sense, the Pope. The sacred invests the secular with authority. Second, there's the conquest of the Byzantine Empire by the Turks in 1453. That means that one of the key features of the Middle Ages is gone. There's the discoveries of Columbus in the Age of Exploration, particularly in 1492, but going on since the founding of the navigation school by Prince Henry the Navigator earlier in the century, then continuing on for another 2 centuries after that. The Reformation itself, as a schism, breaks down the medieval order. Churches are handed over to states, whole countries, whole regions go into schism with each other, and there's no sort of common religious authority. And so without that common religious authority, there is a vacuum of authority that the Enlightenment will come in to fill. And then, in particular, I think there's the dissolution of the monasteries. Right? In Luther's Reformation, the monasteries in Lutheran lands are pretty much abandoned. There will always be a couple Lutherans who try to pursue monasticism. I think there's 2 in the United States right now. Not 2 monasteries, 2 Lutheran monks that are up somewhere in Michigan or Wisconsin. But the monasteries, which had been these pillars of medieval civilization, which had copied the Bible, which had been centers of learning, which had been centers of agriculture and trade and handicrafts and pilgrimage, these were abandoned in Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, and throughout Scandinavia. They are forcibly destroyed by King Henry VIII during the English Reformation, and, as we will see, they are destroyed in France as well. And this total destruction of the Middle Ages is not on purpose. No one's trying to do this, right? Except perhaps the French revolutionaries at that last stage. And maybe some of the reformers, the radical reformers. Luther has no interest in destroying medieval civilization, right? And I don't think Calvin quite does either, but the radical reformers do. But on the whole, these are simply a series of events that happen that cause the dissolution of this civilization, at the same time that the ingredients of modernity are building themselves up. And so as one civilization wanes, modern civilization will come to take its place. But that will be a process that takes really hundreds of years. Now, again, one of the critical ingredients is the scientific revolution itself. And this really kicks off at the exact same time as the Reformation with the work of Nicolaus Copernicus, who lived from 1473 to 1543, and who, upon his death, wrote in 1543 on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, in which he proposed his Copernican system of the universe, in which the sun is at the center and the earth orbits around it, in contradistinction to the older Ptolemaic system. So no longer do we have a geocentric universe. We now have a heliocentric universe. Well, this work was published after his death, partially out of deference to modern scientific questions, but also because he's writing it during the Reformation. And at the same time that Luther is seemingly turning the entire world upside down by making the individual and not the whole church throughout history the definitive interpreter of Scripture, by eliminating the sacramental system and replacing it with justification by grace alone through faith alone, now would probably not be the best time to completely upend the physical system of the universe. But that is exactly what Copernicus's model does. It makes, for instance, Dante's scheme, in which the Earth is the center, and at the very center of the Earth is Satan, at the bottom of the cone of hell. That poetry now only works as poetry. It doesn't work as a kind of realistic model of the universe, although I'm not sure Dante ever meant it to be fully realistic. This publication on the revolution of the heavenly spheres is published by an editor in Nuremberg, Andreas Osiander. Now, we've met Osiander. He's one of the Lutheran reformers. He was there at the Marburg colloquy of 1529. And he's also involved in multiple debates within Lutheranism that are actually really interesting, but we just don't have time to get into them. But he publishes Copernicus's work, and he publishes it with a note saying, "This is merely a mathematical scheme. He's not actually suggesting the ridiculous notion that the Earth moves around the sun." And he's able to do this, one, because Copernicus is dead, but two, because Copernicus largely uses mathematics. It had become clearer and clearer to people that the Ptolemaic system didn't quite work. It didn't take account of the movement of the stars and the planets as well as the ancients thought it did. That, for instance, it had to fit in these things called epicycles to show why there was retrograde motion by the planets. And it wasn't elegant, so Copernicus comes up with a more mathematically elegant system. It's not, however, until later in the century, and even into the next century, that other astronomers begin working to try to demonstrate that something like this is the case. One of the most interesting of these figures is a German or Danish astronomer named Tycho Brahe, lived from 1546 to 1601. And Brahe came up with a system of the universe in which, yes, the sun is at the center, and yes, the planets orbit around the sun. Right? So, however, the sun is not the ultimate center the Earth is. So the sun orbits around the Earth, and the planets orbit around the sun. So the planets don't orbit around the Earth, but the sun still does, and the planets orbit around the sun. Very complicated. And in fact, while it is in some ways mathematically an ingenious system, it doesn't provide the sort of mathematical elegance that Copernicus does. One of the major thinkers, and of course we'll get to the big one momentarily, but another one of the major thinkers was Johannes Kepler, who wrote his 3 Laws of Planetary Motion. But the critical personality is, of course, Galileo Galilei. Now, Galileo is well known, and he's a classic example of this conflict between science and the church. But as it so happens, that's not true at all. So Galileo Galilei, he's Italian, and in 1610 he writes a treatise, a scientific treatise called The Starry Messenger on, I believe it's on comets. He follows this up with The Assayer in 1632. In these works and others, he focuses on the Jovian moons, because Galileo has a new technology. He has the telescope. That's something none of the ancients were able to work with, but Galileo has the telescope. And with the telescope, he's able to look at the Jovian moons, the 4 major moons of Jupiter, and notes that these moons orbit Jupiter. Now you might think, what's so odd about that? Why would that bother the Ptolemaic system, right? You've got the Earth in the center, and then you've got the sun rotating around it. So the sun is in motion. Then you have Jupiter out here. What's wrong with something moving around Jupiter? Well, the problem is that they don't have any knowledge of gravity or inertia. The reason the planets move is because they're like gems embedded within glass balls. And it's not just a rotation of a single lonely object in space moving of its own accord by the forces of inertia and gravity. Rather, the whole sphere is turning, and it is kept turning because it is moving by the will of God. Right? Remember that definition of God by Aristotle, the unmoved mover. God's perfection causes the universe to try to imitate him. But circles can't become squares, so circles sort of move trying to become squares, and they end up sort of just moving around. That's what the spheres were doing. These are concentric spheres within each other, and they're all moving. And it's sort of perfectly laid out, right? You've got the stars, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Moon, Venus, Mercury, and then the Moon, and then Earth, the Sun. Now this shows that the system isn't quite right, because Jupiter's out here and there's something moving around it. So that proves the point that there can't be any sort of spheres that cause motion. Or at least not perfectly symmetrical spheres. And then now Galileo, while he's doing all this work, is under investigation. He's under investigation by a cardinal of the Catholic Church and one of the great figures of the Roman Inquisition after the Council of Trent, Roberto Bellarmino, or Robert Bellarmine, lived from 1562 to 1621. And he begins an investigation of Galileo all the way back in 1610. And then in 1616, the Inquisition issues a condemnation, a posthumous condemnation of Copernicus's views. After all, the trend in the Counter-Reformation is to shut down opposition. And anything that would upend the world seems to be a threat to the nice, orderly world that the Catholic Church is trying to reestablish. Remember, even in the early 17th century, Catholics are not clear, there's no way anyone can know if Protestantism will be a long-term successful movement. It's been around for about 100 years, so were the Cathars, right? And in the 17th century, from 1618 to 1648, Europe will be racked by the 30 Years' War, and one of the goals in that war is to really wipe out Protestantism. Now, it quickly becomes not the goal of the war, nobody actually seriously attempts to do so, but the hope is that over the long term, Protestantism will be defeated, and it will be reincorporated into the Catholic Church with more or less, at this time less, of its distinctiveness intact. So the Counter-Reformation is definitely still in full swing and definitely trying to keep at bay any intellectual forces that would threaten the medieval worldview. In a way, it's in defense of it. It is absolutely opposed to modernity. Galileo then goes and writes his Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems in 1632. And it is written as a dialogue. And it is a dialogue between the Ptolemaic and Aristotelian system. Remember, Aristotle adopts Ptolemy's system, and therefore it's sort of seen as sacrosanct because of Thomas Aquinas and his use of Aristotle. So you've got the Ptolemaic world system, and then on the other hand, you've got the heliocentric Galilean, Copernican world system. And this is a popular book, right? It's written in order to convince people of the rightness of his views. And therefore he is brought up on trial in 1638 and tried for now what is considered the heresy of Copernicanism, of believing that the Earth travels around the sun. And Galileo recants. He's forced to recant. Now this isn't this is the church, I suppose, stamping out science, but remember, the church sees this as a theological debate. At the same time, Copernicus, I believe he'd been a priest, had been supported by the Jesuits, the church had funded his work, and the church continued to fund the work of other astronomers. But Galileo was personally, was very personally invested in this, to the extent that it became a kind of cause célèbre. And so he shut down. And he's forced to recant, and the Vatican has since apologized for this. But apparently, according to legend, and it probably is nothing more than legend, he left the trial and muttered under his breath, "But it does move," right? The Earth, it does move. But he never published on astronomy again. In fact, the rest of his life, most of his primary output, literary output, was letters with his daughter, who was a nun in a convent. Well, the scientific revolution is therefore really shut down within Catholic lands, even though that's where it originates. You also get major advances in anatomy at this point, with things like the anatomy of Thessalius. From there, the scientific revolution is pursued in England. And the person who really standardizes the work that Kepler and Galileo and biologists like Thessalius have been doing is an Englishman by the name of Francis Bacon, who lived from 1561 to 1621. Francis Bacon writes a book in 1620 called the Novum Organum. The Organum, or the Organum, is the book of logic by Aristotle. Right? So the Organum is Aristotle's writings on logic to show how we come to true knowledge. And for Aristotle, that's by, of course, making observations, then drawing logical deductions about them. Bacon, of course, says, okay, you can have legitimate deductions based on observations. However, what you really need is experimentation. So this idea of knowledge by experimentation can be located very strictly within Bacon's Novum Organum. You need to have controls, you need to have variables, you need to run experiments. From there, the English scientific revolution takes off with the chemistry work of Robert Boyle, and then, of course, with Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton lived from 1642 to 1727, and he's most known for his 3 laws of motion. One of them is, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But in this story, what he's actually more notable for is really the discovery of forces like inertia and gravity. Why are these important? Well, because Galileo is able to show, through observation and experimentation, Galileo does this lovely experiment where he goes up the Leaning Tower of Pisa, so he can look over the far edge where there's a direct drop, and he can drop 2 cannonballs of different weights. I think the one that's like a pound and then one that's like 20 pounds, drop them off and demonstrate that they fall at the exact same rate. Now, this was an affront to Aristotle, right? Because Aristotle thought that it's the weight within a thing that causes it to fall at a certain rate. So you would think feathers are light, cannonballs are heavy, feathers fall slower than cannonballs. However, if I were to drop, this little thing, this like tension remover alligator thing, and if I were to drop this book, which I would never do, they would fall at the same rate. The only reason the feather falls slower is because it is designed to catch the air. But things of different weights fall at the same rate, and that rate is 32 feet per second per second. That's the gravitational constant on Earth because of the weight, or because of the mass of the Earth. So Isaac Newton continues experiments like these, but where Galileo was able to demonstrate that the spheres did not exist, what then would cause Jupiter, for instance, to orbit the sun? What would cause it to sort of move in a direction? Now, we all know about inertia, although Aristotle can't quite deal with it. He has a hard time explaining bows and arrows. But let's assume we know about inertia already, right? I shoot a bow and arrow, and the bow goes out, and it moves in a line, right? So if something's moving, it should just move in that line. It should stay constant. Isaac Newton comes up with a theory of gravity, that there is this invisible, indetectable force that acts on all things at a distance, such that here's the sun, and here's Jupiter, and what Jupiter is really doing is its inertia should just carry it like this, right? It should keep going in that direction. But the gravity of the sun catches it, and now it bends toward the sun, and the force of gravity and the force of inertia are equal in such a way that Jupiter remains in a single orbit. So Newton is important for many reasons, but one, he's able to show why Galileo's theory works. And to do so, he has to develop calculus. Isaac Newton invents calculus and inertia and the three laws of motion and the law of gravity. Now, granted, Gottfried Leibniz, a German who lived at the same time, was also inventing calculus. I believe we do use Leibniz's system for calculus notation. Newton was incredibly jealous of him. He accused him of plagiarism, but Leibniz and Newton had never interacted before. And Leibniz died in 1716, and Newton was still alive, so Newton traveled to Germany and danced on his grave. He's really a somewhat petty individual. But why is this theologically significant? Well, if you are a univocalist, that is, you believe that God's existence and our existence is identical, that there is no distinction, for instance, between acts that God causes and acts that we cause. I exist here, and God exists there, and I'm picking up the book, which means God is not. On a univocalist account, the discovery of the laws of motion, gravitation, the force of inertia, and the motion of the planets means that God is not presently active in the universe. God is not presently active in the universe. He might logically need to create it because the universe needs a cause, but he doesn't need to uphold it. The scientific laws do that. Now, of course, if you believe in the analogia entis, if you hold that when we talk about God, we don't sort of confine him to our sphere of existence. Our language can't hold his existence. Our language doesn't sort of reduce his activity to our activity. Then when I do this, when I squeeze this little alligator crocodile thing, God is also doing that. Right? When I drop this phone, yeah, gravity causes that, but so does God through his providential upholding of the laws of gravity. That is the distinction between primary and secondary causation. William Plaker, in his book The Domestication of Transcendence, goes into that in some detail. But not for Newton. Newton, like many moderns, assumes univocity, assumes univocalism. And therefore, what happens? Well, as science discovers more and more things, as science discovers more truths about the universe, as it discovers the ways in which things work naturally by scientific laws and processes, what does that mean? It means that every time we discover that God doesn't do something, and that science does it, God gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Until, finally, he's going to disappear. On a univocalist account, God will disappear. That's a problem for gravity. It's a problem for evolution. It's one reason I think why many Christians are opposed to the modern evolutionary synthesis, is because at heart they're actually univocalists. They actually think that, well, if we came from apes, and apes came from rodents, and rodents came from lizards, and lizards came from the sea, came from an abiogenetic process, well, then it can't be God, right? Because God is a supernatural entity that works in miraculous ways, and natural actions are not actually God's actions. There would be other arguments for creationism, I suppose, but I think that's at the heart of our initial revulsion of it, because we are fundamentally modern rather than ancient or Thomistic. Now, this also leads to a new understanding of how human knowledge works. And this is doing this somewhat in the reverse order that you would learn it in a true philosophy course. But let's take John Locke, for instance. John Locke, many of you may know him from a politics class as the author of the two treatises on government and the originator of the idea of delegated rights and the social contract. Well, not the originator of the idea of the social contract, but the idea of a provisional social contract with delegated rights that stands in many ways behind the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But for today's lecture, John Locke is important because he wrote a seminal work of epistemology, an essay concerning human understanding. All right. Epistemology is not something we've considered in detail up until this point. Right? Generally, we've talked about metaphysics. What is the ultimate nature of being or existence or reality or essences? Right? Is it up there? Is it down here? Does it exist at all? Right? Platonism, Aristotelianism, nominalism. The modern mode of philosophical discourse shifts from being primarily metaphysical to primarily epistemological. The general philosophical question that informs modernity is, how do we know what we know? And Locke is working from Bacon's Novum Organum, from this idea of the scientific method, of knowledge by observation and experimentation. And that's exactly what Locke says. Knowledge comes through experience. Experience of observation, experience of experimentation, experience of things we encounter out there in the world. And it's very much out there in the world. Modern Lockeans, like contemporary Lockeans, would teach Locke's theory as having the human being who is kind of in a box, right? Imagine a human is in a dark room, and in this dark room there are television screens, movie screens, production screens on all surfaces. And the human is in this room, and it can look through the screen and say, okay, on the other side of that screen, what do I see? I see trees. I see birds. Okay, I'm in nature. I'm out on the hiking trail or something, right? Birds and trees and nature on a hiking trail, and I'm in the box, right? I'm in here, and I taste cool water. And I'm like, oh, I've got a water bottle on me, right? You are somewhat abstracted from experience, and you're in the box looking around. However, that's the only place knowledge comes from. You can't turn off the screens and still think. Or you can't think before the screens are turned on. This is basically the position known as British empiricism. Empiricism is the view that knowledge comes through experience, that knowledge is a posteriori. Now, this is a distinction we made when we were discussing the High Middle Ages, between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. A priori knowledge is knowledge that comes logically prior to experience. Things I can know simply based on their definitions. For instance, maybe you know the basics of mathematics, but you have never actually experienced the math problem 243 plus 169, right? You've never experienced that. But I bet with a couple of seconds of thinking through it, you could figure out the answer, right? That's something like a priori knowledge. The key example of a priori knowledge that we've seen in this course before now is Anselm's argument. Anselm of Canterbury's argument for the existence of God based on a priori knowledge. His ontological argument, in which he says that simply the definition of God requires his existence. The definition of God is that God is the being greater than which no other may exist. You don't have to have experienced God. You don't have to experience the world. You don't even have to believe that the world outside of your brain is real. All of this could be a simulation. We could all be in the Matrix, and yet you could go, yeah, if God exists, God is the being greater than which no other existence can be conceived. Right? God is the highest order being. Well, try to deny it. Okay, I don't believe that being exists. Well, you don't think God exists, so you're imagining a being that is greater than all other existence, but it doesn't contain within itself the quality of existence? That's a logical contradiction, right? No experience necessary. It's an a priori argument. And we have also seen a posteriori arguments for the existence of God. Thomas Aquinas favors these. So, for instance, all things that begin to exist have a cause. Well, we kind of have to experience that, right? We might get there by logical necessity, but not necessarily. And then, the space-time universe has a cause. Well, that we definitely need experience for, right? Like, we need to understand the nature of causation. We need to experience it. We need to do some scientific analysis. Did the universe begin? Oh, the Big Bang happened. Okay, yeah, the universe began at some point. Oh, maybe there was something before the Big Bang? Right, but where did space and time themselves come from? Can there be an infinite regression of time, of points in time, such that this point in time is different than this point in time, right? How can I actually say those are different if they're on an infinite scale in either directions, especially back? So we would actually have to do the work of the scientific work to come up with that secondary postulate. And then on the basis of those, oh, there is a cause of space-time that is beyond space and time, that is all-powerful, or at least sufficiently powerful to create space and time out of nothing, which is pretty dang powerful. That second form, a posteriori knowledge, is the form that Locke favors and that British empiricism favors. It's not confined to arguments to the existence of God, however. It's not terribly interested in them at all. Rather, it says that true knowledge comes through a posteriori experience. Experience after the fact, after experience. So that we are born blank slates. This is Locke's preferred term. We are tabula rasa, like a blank chalkboard, right? We are blank slates when we are born. There's no good, there's no evil, there's no concepts. We are empty jars when we are conceived, and experience fills them. Which means there can be no natural knowledge of God, which means that all knowledge has to come through experience and experimentation and observation, which ultimately means that if we want to believe in Christianity, we have to prove it, right? There's no such thing as knowledge by belief in British empiricism. We would have to prove it. Now, we've seen many proofs for the existence of God up till this point, although it's really at this point in the course where proofs for God become sort of necessary. Like, we've got to prove that this thing is true, otherwise it's not true. See, non-belief has become sort of the default, right? You don't believe, and then later on, you've got to choose to believe, or you've got to figure out how to believe. You've got to come up with a rational or empirical argument, a historical argument, perhaps. And one of the famous arguments for the existence of God at this point is the argument by a Frenchman, Blaise Pascal, a 17th century thinker, who is a Jansenist. Now, who are the Jansenists? The Jansenists are largely French Catholics who have something of the Huguenot Calvinists about them. They remain within the Catholic Church, although they are ultimately condemned later on. But they follow a thinker named Cornelius Jansen, who is a scholar of Augustine. He wrote a book posthumously published in 1640 called Augustinus, in which he looked to Augustine as really the critical Catholic thinker and interpreted Augustine according to Augustine's late period, his anti-Pelagian period, which gives you a much more Calvinistic picture of Augustine. Now, the Jansenists and the Jesuits fought each other in France for a long time, but it's indicative of French Catholicism during this period that there is this seeking out of a more rational form of Christianity, and ultimately that will result in a break from Christianity as a whole in favor of rationalism. More on that later. But Blaise Pascal is a Jansenist, and he comes up with an interesting argument for the existence of God called Pascal's wager. And I think it's instinctual, you may have heard it before, but it goes like this. If I believe in God, and I'm right, if I believe in Christ, and I'm right, and I die, and I go to heaven, it's cost me a lifetime of devotion to Christ, and I get eternal rewards. That's entirely worth it. If I disbelieve in God, if I don't believe in God, I don't believe in Christ, and I live my life the way I want, and I die, and then I pop out of existence, I've not really lost anything, right? Now, if I believe in Christ, and I live life as a Christian, and I die and I'm wrong, then I've lost Nothing, right? The Christian life is a good life. Ultimately, unless you have a really immoral sensibility, you haven't really lost anything. In fact, the one life that you've lived ultimately probably doesn't have any meaning anyway, right? Because there's no endurance of it. You haven't really lost anything. However, if I live life wrong, if I disbelieve in God, I don't believe in Christ, and I live life as a pagan, and I'm wrong, then I lose everything. So if I'm a Christian and I'm wrong, I don't lose anything. But if you're an atheist and you're wrong, you'll lose everything, right? So that's the bet. Better to be on the side of Christianity, right? It's not really an argument for the existence of God so much as a kind of modal argument for being a Christian. The question here I would ask is, does this actually get you across the threshold of belief? Do you go, well, yeah, I better be a Christian then, but it doesn't really convince? Do you then go, yeah, I'll work on... Can you actually will yourself to believe something? And if you don't actually believe it, say, all right, I'm going to force myself to believe this. Maybe over time, maybe. But that's a tall order. And I actually bring it up perhaps simply to demonstrate the weakness of Christian arguments during this period. Notice there's no appeal to sort of like higher reality or the way in which Christianity reveals the most embedded truths of the universe. Rather, it's, boy, I sure hope we're right. And if we're not, well, then we don't lose anything. But if you're wrong, you'll lose everything. It's kind of threatening, right? It doesn't actually sort of unveil the mystery of the universe in any way. I like Pascal, don't get me wrong. His Provincial Letters, his Pensées, great stuff. But it is indicative of this time period when Christians are making arguments like that for belief in God. Christians are coming up with a chronology. Ussher's chronology of the age of the universe is written at this time, and trying to show from the archaeological record that Christianity is true. That utterly fails. And many other arguments for the existence of God, and they just don't live up to the philosophical challenge of the age. Now, the other option besides British empiricism is continental rationalism, right? It's on the European continent, not on the island of Great Britain. And it's a priori, it's rationalist. It focuses on true knowledge in the mind. And the earliest continental rationalists are actually trying to really be Aristotelian, to be Thomist, to defend Catholicism. And the person we should associate this with primarily is René Descartes. René Descartes, who lived from 1596 to 1650, he lived through the 30 Years' War, and he was an extraordinary mathematician. He wrote his Discourse on Method in 1637. He did a lot of work on geometry. But in 1641, he writes his critical work, Meditations on First Philosophy. And this gets us into that second ingredient we're talking about today, the method of systematic doubt. That is, how do I know what I know? Right? This is a basic question of epistemology. And Descartes begins with doubt. Well, how do I know that I'm the son of my parents? I can't really know that. I guess I could trust them, but how do I know? Right? See, belief as a form of trust leading to true knowledge just wiped off the table. How do I know? How do I know that I am living where I'm living? How do I know that what I've read in history books or scientific books is true? How do I know ultimately whether or not I'm here right now? Like, am I in a simulation? Or am I, as he would put it, in a dream? Okay, so what if I'm in a dream? What if I'm in the Matrix? Well, then nothing around me is true, right? Like, none of my sense data. You see how this goes back behind British empiricism? None of my sense data is true. I can't trust my five senses. So, well, I can trust the truths of mathematics, right? Well, can you though? right? I think 2 plus 2 equals 4, but what if there is an evil demon that's deceiving me? So that he's tricking my mind and making me think that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and it really doesn't. So I can't even know that. What is the one thing at the end of all this doubt that I can know? No, not that I'm in a body, not that I have 5 senses, not even the a priori truths of mathematics, but simply the only undoubtable piece of information: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I must exist. I cannot doubt my own existence, because even in the act of doubting, I must exist. Now, actually, I wonder what he would have done with the Hindu and Buddhist critique, that ultimately your thinking is a kind of illusion, right? Yeah, something exists, so you can't doubt that anything exists, but your individuality doesn't exist in Hinduism or Buddhism. Your individuality is an illusion. Really, you are simply one manifestation of the larger entity of Brahma. But that aside, Descartes moves us down to just thinking things. Now, he tries to get us out of this, right? And he gets us out of this by pursuing an a priori ontological argument for the existence of God. He says, here I am, this thinking thing, that's all I can know about myself, and I don't know what's true. Well, am I the highest? Okay, so I'm the only thing that exists. Well, could I really be the only thing that exists? Did I cause myself? Could I truly be the highest thing? Well, no, I can't be. So there must be something else, and that other thing would be God, right? There must be something that caused me. That thing would be God, and that thing is God, and therefore God would naturally have to be good, and therefore he sort of tries to get us out of this. But notice what Descartes does. First of all, he grounds it in a priori knowledge. He ignores sense data altogether. Second, what does he make the human being primarily into? Not a sort of deeply feeling, desiring thing, like an Augustine. Not a hylomorphic unity, in which the soul is the form of the body. So we find our souls right here, in the shape of our body and in the pattern of our life. Not even the sort of trusting, existentially distressed but comforted person that we find in Luther. Rather, just a thinking thing, just a brain on a stick. You are fundamentally your mind, not your body. And look what this does to modernity. It means that you are your mind and not your body, which means your body is kind of your mind's property. And once we get the technology, we could modify our bodies accordingly, right? So this is part of this overall mentality, and it's a little bit Gnostic too, right? I am primarily my mind. Well, how does my mind interface with the body? How do they relate to each other if they're different things? How would they, for instance, when the brain says, lift your right arm, okay, I'm going to think of it really hard. Lift your right arm. Right? And now I'm not going to think of it at all. How does that work? Right? How does that work if we are primarily thinking things and not bodies? And Descartes has quite a bit to say to that. He actually thinks there's a physical organ in the brain. I think he identifies the pineal gland and says that's the interface between the brain and the body. But he's never able quite to overcome that distinction, and neither is modernity. Because, see, this is what British empiricism and continental rationalism have in common. That there is a disconnect between the physical embodied world out here and the mind. Now, we are primarily our minds in both, but our minds are sort of independent in continental rationalism. In British empiricism, our minds are fed sense data, and so we get information from outside, whereas in continental rationalism, our minds have a lot of a priori knowledge, including our own existence and the existence of God. And so we are born with knowledge of God. So continental rationalism tries to be a bit closer to Christianity than British empiricism does, or at least historic Christian teaching about the person. But both of them end up dividing the I, the ego, the self, the mind, from the body, the external, the world. And this means that modernity, for all its emphasis on materialism, for all its emphasis on worldly and human goods, for all its emphasis on what we can do, think of nominalism, what we can do to name and therefore shape things with technology, for all of that, it also ends up as fundamentally Gnostic. Now, there are other continental rationalists. Gottfried Leibniz, one of the founders of calculus, was one. But the other person I'd like to mention briefly is Benedict or Baruch Spinoza, who lived from 1632 to 1677. He died young. I think he actually died in the midst of a pogrom. I could be mistaken, though. Spinoza is a Jewish deist. He is Jewish, but not a religious Jew, living in the Netherlands, I think Amsterdam. And Spinoza is notable because, as a continental rationalist, he denies the existence of an independent God, right? So he takes Descartes' argument, I am fundamentally my mind, I could doubt everything else, but I'm not my own creator. I exist, but I don't exist self-sufficiently or necessarily. Therefore, I must be created by something else. That other thing is God. Spinoza says, well, why couldn't that other thing just be like your parents or something? Why do you have to jump to God from yourself? At least Aquinas jumps from the entire cosmos to God, right? All things that exist must have a cause. Why you individually? And Spinoza also takes seriously Anselm's ontological argument. He says, okay, well, there must be some highest thing. There must be some... I'm sorry, he's not a deist. There must be some highest entity. Something that is necessarily self-existent, that exists as part of its essence, it is in its essence to exist, and that is at the very top of the great chain of being, right? It's the highest thing. And Spinoza says, yeah, that exists. Well, you could call it God if you wanted, but I'm going to choose to call it the universe, right? See, Spinoza is interesting because he's trying to get to atheism. But unlike the modern atheists, especially people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett, he actually knows philosophy. He's one of the great philosophical thinkers of the early modern period, one of the, 6 or so greatest. And he says, now, there must be something on top, but that thing is the universe itself. The universe is God, and God is the universe. The universe is self-caused. It is self-existent. It has its own sufficient grounds for existence within itself. That argument, known as pantheism, the idea that all things are identical to God collectively, means that Spinoza can get around the idea of a transcendent God separate from and creator of the cosmos. And it means that within the cosmos there can be meaning sort of in our lives. So it's a really ingenious move, and I think it's the move you have to make if you want to deny the existence of God actively. You have to not deny the existence of God, but you have to say that the universe is God on any classical definition of true godhood, of the high God. So atheism, a sort of functional atheism that is philosophically closer to pantheism, is now an option on the table. And with that, we come to the Enlightenment, this third ingredient of today's lecture. I want to distinguish the Enlightenment from the Renaissance in the same way we distinguish the Renaissance from the Reformation. The Reformation is trying to fix something that is broken. The Renaissance is trying to go back and find something that was lost. In the 8th and 9th centuries, that was trying to recover the Christian civilization that had been destroyed by the barbarians, the Roman Christian civilization. In the 12th century, it was the recovery of Greek scientific and medical knowledge. And in the 15th and 16th century Italian and European Renaissances, it was the recovery of ancient law, rhetoric, politics, social goods, and literature. The Enlightenment is the first movement, the first serious intellectual movement that says there's no going back. It takes the lesson of 1492, of Columbus's discovery of whole new worlds, and saying the only way forward is forward. Humanity must be enlightened. Humanity as a whole is coming into its own. We now have the tools, the scientific tools, the philosophical tools, in order to put behind us superstitions and myths. Ideas like the Trinity, or the real presence and communion, or the idea that water can make a Christian. Get rid of all that. The Enlightenment is there is a kind of, there's Catholic Enlightenment, there's Protestant Enlightenment. So I don't want to give the impression that the Enlightenment is exclusively a secular movement. But in general, this is the mode that it takes. So how would you have a Christian Enlightenment? Well, you could say everything except the faith, very narrowly conceived as belief in these certain propositions. Like, there is a God, there is a Trinity, there is the Son of God, he became incarnate, but that happened a long time ago. Everything but that was wrong. So get rid of medieval civilization, medieval political structures, medieval scientific worldview, get rid of all of it. Everything in the world is going to move forward, but we'll hold on to belief in, like, the Nicene Creed or something like that. I think you can see why that's such an unstable position, because the Nicene Creed originates in the world of late antiquity, in the world of antiquity. It helps shape and grows and matures within the medieval world. And dissection of the medieval world is a kind of vivisection of the faith. Well, the Enlightenment, on the whole, though, so it doesn't care about religion except as really the enemy. It's a kind of superstitious movement, especially the French Enlightenment. So the sort of radical form of the Enlightenment, we find people like Voltaire. Voltaire was a Frenchman, he has a much longer name, I can't remember it, lived from 1694 to 1778, so this is primarily an 18th century movement. Voltaire was this believer in, in sort of practically dealing with the problems we have now by freeing men's minds, and freedom becomes a major theme at this point. America is an Enlightenment nation, no question about it. It might also be a Christian nation, and I have some friends who vehemently argue that it is, or that at least it is Christian in its origin and conception, but it is also undeniably an Enlightenment nation. So Voltaire wants to free the human mind from the shackles of religion and free the human body from the shackles of the tyranny of the King of France. The French kingship now seems like this sort of artificial, superstitious entity. Voltaire is famous for saying that the last man will not be free until the last priest is strangled with the entrails of the last king. So much for the medieval worldview, right? The medieval worldview that was so characterized by this alliance between the king's throne and the priest's altar. Wipe that all away and start new. Another thinker in this vein is the fellow Frenchman and author, partial author of the Encyclopédia, Denis Diderot, also 18th century, who is certainly a real atheist. He doesn't have sort of the subtle pantheistic view of Spinoza, simply there is no God. Another one of these critical Enlightenment thinkers is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, who we should all know from American history. One of the founding fathers. In general, unless they are out-and-out atheists, Enlightenment figures follow Isaac Newton in believing in a viewpoint called deism. Now, there is a view called theism, and in some sense all of us are theists. Jews, Muslims, Christians are theists. We believe in the personal theos, a personal God. Deism self-consciously comes from the Latin deus. Deus, which means God in Latin, but it's taken to be an impersonal God. This means that you can believe in some sort of God, that there is some sort of God out there, but there's nothing supernatural, right? This God does not intervene in history. This God does not sort of, push him through the miraculous, let alone become incarnate. This God exists only because reason demands that God exists, right? The universe had to have come from somewhere. This God must exist. And this creator then is able to establish natural laws, both natural physical laws, like the law of gravity, the law of inertia, and natural moral laws, like don't kill, don't steal, right? So we get a natural and a moral order, and we get a God, but Christianity is not part of deism. Although in the same way that modernity, and some of the worst aspects of modernity in particular, have infected Christianity, so too deism seems to have infected Christianity by way of univocalism. Because what do you have in most Christians' understanding? That God doesn't interfere in most of human history, but then suddenly he interferes by becoming incarnate in Jesus, and then he's risen, right? And then he goes away, and now we're down here. We're sort of left with the Bible or the church or whatever. There is a kind of deist Christianity, even one that strongly believes in the incarnation. But the incarnation isn't sort of a prototype for the normal action of God. So when you take away the sacraments, you often get a deist form of Christianity. And plopping in charismatic gifts can be a way in which the Wesleyan holiness tradition, the Pentecostal charismatic tradition, tries to undo some of that deism. And yet, there is still this sense that if God's acting, it better have a miraculous sign, right? God's either acting miraculously, and therefore you can see it through speaking in tongues, or he's not acting at all. That's actually a fairly deist understanding of how God acts. So, the Enlightenment seems to be another good move for the state. And there are many monarchs at this time who support Enlightenment deism. People like Catherine II, Empress of Russia, Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, King of Prussia, which will become an important state as time moves on. These monarchs are all technically Christian, right? They go to Christian services, but they, I don't know if they commune at their Orthodox or Catholic services, or Lutheran, I suppose, in the case of Prussia. But they think of Christianity as merely a sort of a way in which the common folk are made moral, right? Like that's the use of Christianity, is that Christianity makes people behave morally, and that's what it's for. In fact, as we'll see in the future, as I hope we'll see in the future, that is exactly the perspective of Karl Marx, that Christianity sort of is for the common people, and it's the opiate of the people, and it's keeping them blind to the real injustices in the world. So Enlightenment monarchs promote something called enlightened absolutism, which is this view that that just as the deist God exercises total and absolute control in creation, that the Enlightenment monarchs shouldn't be encumbered by all these things like oaths of loyalty to their vassals and the feudal relationships that go with that. They certainly shouldn't have to deal with the church, with bishops who are nobles that own land, or with the Pope. Rather, they should have total and complete sovereign control within their territories. Enlightened absolutism, in its suspicion of the church, becomes a suspicion of what remains of feudalism and what remains of the church's involvement in politics. This will eventually result in the destruction of the Papal States. It is also worth noting that while the American founders are not Enlightenment absolutists, not by any means, they are Enlightenment Republicans. Now, some of them are Christians, some of them are deists. Think of George Washington here. George Washington reads his Bible, he's a moral person, and he goes to church every week. But he never takes communion, right? Because that's superstitious. Doesn't even take it, right? Doesn't take it and think, this isn't really the Bible. Just doesn't take it at all. That's a weird, superstitious ritual. just do away with it. Just go to church, read the Bible, get your moral lesson in the sermon, and then take that morality and go be a moral public persona. That's an extremely enlightenment way of thinking about Christianity. In fact, this is the time period in history where the government is seen as being, or the state is seen as being primarily a human creation. So you have figures like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Adam Smith. All of these thinkers think of the state as a primarily human political project, as a creation of humans for humans. And that if it has a religious component, as for instance the British system does in having a confessional church, as most states do after the Westphalian settlement in 1648, that confessional church is really seen as being at the service of the state. So that when it comes to government, the state is really in the driver's seat, and the church should probably just be grateful for whatever it receives. And as we've discussed at other times, what it receives generally is a manipulation of the church's purposes on behalf of the state. That's a very different arrangement. That early modern confessional state arrangement is very different from what we see earlier in the Middle Ages. Now, with people like John Locke, who in his 2 treatises on civil government says that governments are instituted in order to protect the rights of life, liberty, and property, and that people retain these rights, that government has a very rational purpose, and that purpose is simply to deal out justice rather than allowing private individuals to take vengeance when justice occurs. All the mystique that goes along with monarchy and royalty and nobility, all of that is like air sucked out of the room very suddenly. We can see this coming to a higher pitch in the writings of another French Enlightenment philosopher, someone who knew Diderot and Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in his 1754 Discourse on Inequality and his 1762 Social Contract discussed the possibility of a majoritarian parliament within France. Well, that is exactly what comes of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is at its most severe and most radical in France. And it reaches a pitch with events like the storming of the Bastille in the French Revolution, which begins in 1789. By 1791, they chop off the king's head. They chop off the head of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Maybe that was 1792. And they establish a parliamentary democracy in France. However, very quickly, for reasons that later French thinkers like Alexis de Tocqueville would reflect on thoroughly, it descends into tyranny. This democratic revolution doesn't end the way the American Revolution ends, in a fundamentally constitutional and republican experiment. It ends in the guillotine. Priests have their heads chopped off, monks have their heads chopped off, nobles have their heads chopped off. The monasteries are all seized by the government, and many of them are destroyed. So Cluny, the old monastery of Cluny, that form of Benedictine monasticism that supported pilgrims on the way to Santiago de Compostela and led a series of anti-corruption reforms in the church, that monastery is destroyed. Clairvaux, where Bernard of Clairvaux was based, it becomes a prison first for political prisoners and now a normal prison today. The church lands are seized. So even to this day in France, the Cathedral of Notre Dame is not owned by the church, the way, say, a Catholic parish or a Catholic cathedral here would be. Church lands are owned by the state, and the church rents them from the state in order to conduct services. At this time, the great Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame are transformed into temples of reason. So Notre Dame is made into a temple of Lady Reason or Lady Liberty or something like that. And they set up a statue to Lady Reason on the altar. So see, it's replacing Mary with, it's still Our Lady, Notre Dame, but it becomes Our Lady Reason, a sort of personification of the rational, rather than Mary as a sort of personification of lay religion. The French Revolution, of course, doesn't remain confined to France. This is one of the things that modern states tend to do. They try to export their form of political modernity. Now, we're more familiar with that in the 20th century as a fascist or a communist move. Right, the fascists try to export they actually just try to expand their state through conquest. The communists try to export their form of political modernity by causing communist revolutions in other countries. But we can really see from the French Revolution all the way up until the Iraq War that Western democracies are not immune from this. Right? Western democracies, that form of political modernity we call liberalism, also tends to violently export its political mechanisms to other countries. And the French begin this as only the second major modern political power after the United States. So the French go on the warpath. They invade several other countries. They invade the Holy Roman Empire, and they destroy the Holy Roman Empire. In 1808, it's completely destroyed. More on that momentarily. And eventually they go to war with the British. The commander of the French Revolutionary Armies, who ultimately is able to wrest control from the democratic government, the totalitarian democratic government, the Jacobins, and transforms it into a sort of one-party absolutist state, is Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of Napoleon, and he fits into church history in this way. Napoleon seizes control of France as the great general of the French armies in, I believe, 1798, after his Egyptian, or shortly before his Egyptian campaign. But it's in 1804 that Napoleon declares himself to be emperor. Now, at this point, he has taken the popes captive. Napoleon invades Italy in 1796. He has Pope Pius VI captive in Valence from 1775 to 1779. The next pope, Pius VII, who is pope from 1800 to 1823, so that throughout the remainder of Napoleon's reign and the post-Napoleonic era, signs a treaty with the Napoleon and the papacy sign a papal treaty known as a Concordat in 1801, basically saying, okay, you can be the pope, but there are no papal states, right? This is a critical move. Actually, we'll talk about why that's critical momentarily. But the Pope is seen to no longer be a political prisoner, right? If some of the French revolutionaries had their way, they would just wipe out the papacy entirely, much as they wiped out the church within France entirely. But Napoleon is more pragmatic, I would say. And while there's no love lost between him and the Catholic Church, he also sees the function of the church. Like all modern confessional states, the church is at the service of the sovereign state. However, there's no question as to who is in the driver's seat. When Napoleon crowns himself as emperor in 1804, it means a number of things. One, notice the title he's taking. He's not becoming king of France. He's taking the title of emperor. Right? And remember the theology, the political theology of empire. There can be only one. To be an emperor is to be sort of the global, ecumenical, heck, even cosmic political ruler. So there's only one Roman emperor. They divide it, but it never works. And then Charlemagne in 800 has the crown placed on his head on Christmas Day by Pope Leo III, which means that he is the true successor to the Romans, not the Empress Irene in the East. Convenient that it was a woman on the throne. It's easier to make the claim against her. Right? So you have these two competing emperors, but there clearly should be only one. And then later on, that the original Holy Roman Empire sort of shifts over to Germany under the Ottonian dynasty, And there it's been, the Holy Roman Empire, in German-speaking areas since about the year 950. Well, Napoleon destroys the Holy Roman Empire, and he ends it. For 1,000 years, these emperors have held the imperial crown, claiming to be the true successors of old Rome. And Napoleon then, later in 1804, takes it for himself, and he crowns himself emperor. Emperor of France, yes, but in some sense, emperor of the New World Order, the world order based in the Enlightenment. So the Pope is present at his coronation, and the Pope has the crown, and the Pope's getting ready to put it on Napoleon's head. What does Napoleon do? Not like Charlemagne, doesn't let a Pope put it on his head. Napoleon grabs the crown from Pius VII and puts it on his own head. That's the symbolism here. Not only taking authority away from the church, but also humanity crowns itself. It's the ultimate Enlightenment move. Humanity crowns itself. Well, ultimately, Napoleon is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. First at, I think, Trafalgar, and then the Battle of Waterloo. He's in captivity twice. He escapes. He comes back. There's another battle. It's a whole thing. Napoleon ultimately loses. However, the democratic and Enlightenment forces that Napoleon has unleashed, that the French Revolution has unleashed, never quite die out. There's another attempt in 1848 at democratic revolution. There's more in nation states can rise, and we'll talk about all that later. But this is really the key point of modernity, in which all the elements of modernity really come together, and the church has to deal with them. So after Napoleon is kicked out of Italy by the Allied forces, the Papal States are reestablished. So the Pope is, again, no longer simply the Pope, but he's also the king of a kingdom in central Italy in 1814. However, that is ultimately done away with. And you know what? We will cover that in another lecture. I think we will draw this one to a close by pointing out that the defeat of Napoleon doesn't in any way signify the defeat of the Enlightenment or of modernity as a whole. Rather, it's the first battle in which modernity seems to lose, but it will ultimately be victorious. In fact, it will almost be victorious because of the defeat, because all the Allied powers ultimately start to take on these ideas about the relationship between the state and the church, between society and the state, between the church and science, between faith and reason. And while it seems like a defeat for the Enlightenment in the Catholic world, oddly enough, it's the Protestant victors in England who end up becoming the most modern nation. And it's to that story that we're going to turn in our next two lectures.